Welcome to another episode from Moses Podcast Network, IPAs, APIs over IPAs. We provide API analytics for API product managers and other API professionals. Joining me today is Phil Nash over at Twilio. He's one of the earliest developer experience professionals at the API First Pioneer, Twilio, which focuses on communication, SMS, and now you're getting into video and a lot of other things. Super happy to have you here, Phil.
It's so good to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Great to be here. I got to point out, I'm sort of maybe one of the earliest developer experience professionals, like still at Twilio, but like I joined in 2014 and we've been going since 2008. And some of the earliest hires were on the evangelism team, and I'm just building. I get to build on top of a lot of the work they did in those first 6 years before I even got there. But it's a pleasure to be as part of that and carry on that work, and have done for quite a while now. So.
Definitely. And I would love to hear a little bit more around that story on, I guess Twilio was what, a couple hundred people when you joined then, and what was that journey like, building out the developer evangelism team and up to what, 4,500 people now for Twilio or something?
It is something like that. I think we probably just released bigger numbers recently, actually, but we'll stick with 4,500 for now. We just keep buying companies at the moment, and that makes the numbers go up fast. It's been an incredible journey, really. When I joined Twilio, I think it was about 300 people in the company when I joined in 2014, and it was the biggest company that I'd worked at that time, which was a weird thing for me. I'd gone from a company of like an agency that had got never bigger than 50 people into this 300 person company. It felt like a big place to me, and now that it's into the thousands, it's overwhelming at times. But I've always it's been nice for me because I worked initially in the London office, and now I'm down in Australia, and always sort of part of the kind of satellite teams, which has always felt like a bit smaller, a bit more family for me. But it's always nice it's incredible to know that there's this huge sort of machine behind me to do all the work and produce what the products we do. So when I joined, the evangelism team was just in the process of actually splitting into two teams, which was the start of our journey into building what we now call our developer network team, which encompasses all sorts of facets of the developer kind of experience with Twilio and the community experience of Twilio as well. So at that time, we were just kind of considering what became our developer education team, which is a team solely focused on the documentation and platform for the documentation, and building that kind of thing into a practice that they could focus on. I think that's so over the last 7 years, the building Twilio and certainly building the experience of Twilio has been a case of more and more focus of things. And so, like I said, we've gone from that original evangelism team, and then two guys split out from there to do the education team and built out the docs platform. And since then, they've built a game. They've built Twilio Quest, which is have you seen that?
I don't think so, but sounds interesting. I want to check it out.
Yes, please do. It's coming up to a fancy new release actually sometime soon. But it's a game. It's a full 2D top-down kind of RPG adventure that also teaches you how to code and how to use the Twilio APIs, as well as kind of introductions to other programming languages at the moment. And we're just working on, or it's possible now to actually build your own levels for that as well. So we're hoping to see a lot more stuff coming out of that. And so we built that, and then we have our sort of more community-focused team, which has kind of been in and out of things that used to handle social and things like that, but now is focused on our forums and champions programs and things like that. Meanwhile, the evangelism team continues to try and go out to where developers are in the world, or where they are online, I guess, more likely in the last sort of 18 months, in order to take the word of Twilio to them, but also kind of bring that experience back. And so, but in the meantime, of course, we've also grown enormous numbers of products. When I started, there was voice, there was SMS, and you could make phone calls from a browser, and mobile devices, mobile apps, sorry, rather than devices. And since then we've added chat and video and all sorts of other additions to that has spread the knowledge quite thin. And then of course bought in other companies. So we bought in Authy and added like two-factor authentication and verification as a thing. Bought in more recently SendGrid and then Segment. And so I'm still catching up on, I have no idea how you use Segment yet, but I'll get there. I'm getting better at SendGrid though. Email deliverability is not as easy as one might think when you just send emails during the day. So yeah, so there's been a lot of that, but the product, I think the nice thing is that the product and everything at Twilio has always kind of remained developer first, and that allows us to support and help developers along the way, all the way through that from 7 years ago to today.
No, it's funny that you mentioned, acquiring all these different companies. We're a SendGrid customer. I think we're a Twilio customer to power some of our learning features. We're partnered with Segment, so I guess really intertwined with Twilio over there.
Seems that way, yeah. I think that's what we're trying to do. Is I guess we noticed that these things fit well together, and I think SendGrid is kind of fairly obvious that it's a communications channel that we didn't have. And getting SendGrid involved was picking the best company out there on the market that was doing it to become part of Twilio. But then Segment might seem a little bit weird, but at the end of the day, behind all of the communications things is actually like customer journeys and customer data that you actually want to expose to the way that you then communicate with people. And so it's I think it's an exciting future for how that all ties together. Yeah.
Has that made developer evangelism a challenge? Going from just talking about SMS and how to send a message versus now you got SendGrid, now you have all these different, I guess, ways about thinking about marketing to developers. And is it a common, process or common language that you have, or is it up to each product or each area?
That's a good question. I think it's become more difficult in sort of the elevator pitch. Certainly when you used to be able to say you can send and receive text messages, make and receive phone calls, go have at it, it's an API, go to kind of this wide expanse of things that you need longer elevators for that kind of thing. But once I think it's difficult to say. Like the expanse of the marketing team and getting the message out for this has been an important part of it as well. On the other hand, like we still are working to integrate some of these purchases. So like Segment for the most part continues to look after itself and continue its own kind of messaging and things out to people. So that's been easier for now. I think it'll be interesting to look to Signal, which is our conference in October, for how that messaging kind of comes together, because that's everything Twilio under one roof at that point, and we'll see some interesting things there. I think nothing I can give away right now, as far as I'm aware.
And I would love to hear just more around how do you structure, developer relations? We got so many different roles these days: developer advocate, developer experience, developer relations itself. How is that structured at Twilio, and what have you seen work well in terms of responsibilities?
Yeah, that is a good question, and I will actually be upfront with you. Like developer experience, whilst you step one step back. Actually, I think developer experience is important to all of Twilio, right? If the API teams, if the APIs that we're producing aren't great for developers, then everything falls down on that. And everything else becomes sort of layers on top of that to make life better, easier for developers. But there is a developer experience team that is not within the developer relations team, in which they, and this is what we call our teams, I guess, but in which they are focused on making sure those APIs are indeed of a standard and consistent quality across the business, now that there's so many parts of it. So like I said, like in the sort of developer relations side of things, we have this developer network team, which deals with evangelism, as that kind of going out to communities and developers out there, education, building the docs platform, and Twilio Quest as a game. The community is looking after the forum. We also have within there, we have an enterprise evangelism team, which is actually it's a relatively new addition to this, in which we're taking kind of the tactics and practices of regular evangelism and community events, but to larger businesses, enterprises, effectively, to take them through hackathons and innovation kind of sessions, and give them the opportunity to, or give those businesses the opportunity to share a problem with their developers, have that hopefully communications and the Twilio platform can help solve, have kind of Twilio experts on hand, but then just set them going for a day or two to try and build their own solutions, build their own, solve their own problems. And I think we find within enterprise, that tends to be a place where developers maybe don't get that decision-making opportunity that often. But when you put a problem in front of them, and a tight deadline and a small team to work on it, the developers have a great time kind of building and finding this out, even if it's their first experience with the API. So that's what our kind of enterprise evangelism team does, is take Twilio out to those companies like that. And like I said, it's that same kind of experience as regular in the community kind of thing, but moved to that enterprise experience, and it makes those developers a lot happier. It's amazing. What else do we have? We then look at the startups team as well. That's fostering those newer and smaller companies that, where everybody in the team, everybody in the company could be a developer, or is at least a builder, is somebody who's wanting to produce something in the world, and the support and a little bit of funding, some credits go into the Twilio Startups program, kind of helps them get off the ground, and that's great. So there's so many parts of this, and I've been talking about and working on the Twilio CLI, for example, and that itself as a project came out of the developer education team. So the team working on the docs were just like, we think we should have this as well. But that is now, I think that is been taken over by a developer experience team, actually, which is good. Because it's funny that some of these projects just came out of like people wanting them to exist in the world, and then turning that into something that we can call GA, generally available, is a different matter. It's not just a version 1 on an NPM module, sadly, when you want people to deal with it. So yeah, there are those developer experience things there, and a developer interfaces team as well, which works on all the helper libraries and other kind of stuff like that. I mean, the helper libraries themselves are written by a program that looks at our specs, but so the developer interfaces team deals with the bits around the edges of that, and as well as the program outputting it as well. This is kind of, I think, before like OpenAPI spec library generators existed, and we sat down and wrote our own against our own specifications. So that's got its interesting things to deal with as well. It's a big Python program that writes out all our libraries. So it's can be a pain if you want to change the JavaScript library and you have to change to Python writing JavaScript in order to fix it. But for the most part, it doesn't need that much fixing anymore. It just generates stuff, and that's nice. So yeah, there's lots of teams, there's lots of things going on that kind of specifically focus on this experience side of things. But that structure is ever growing as we find other places to focus in on, and yeah.
So what motivated creating that CLI, and how do you measure the experience of it? I mean, it's not like a web app where you can just install, Amplitude or something in it.
That's true. So yeah, like I said, the CLI itself came out of a desire of the developer education team to build. I think one, as developers, we don't necessarily like to get away from the keyboard that often, and so giving people an option to interact with their Twilio accounts that isn't just through the UI in the console was one of the plans there, but also the idea that maybe you can use this CLI as part of like a build process or build pipeline as well. Those are the kind of two things that they wanted to solve for. They built that, and some of the early ways they got feedback on it was actually at our Signal conference back in, let's say 2018 perhaps, where we would take people off and have kind of proper user experience testing sessions with them, like sit them in front of a keyboard with the CLI and say, with the early version of the CLI, and say, just go, like, try and achieve this with it, and how did you get on with that? So that was really good for early learning on that. But then how you measure like a CLI usage after that, it's kind of hard. You're right, you can't just whack analytics in it, although I think we are working more on that. I mean, so a rough thing is, and the CLI is published as both an NPM module and a package on Homebrew right now. So we are trying to, I think, add more packaging options to that, so you don't have to have installed Node in order to run it on most systems. But we're getting to that. But like, you know, the NPM installs is a blunt kind of tool to say, are people using it? Are people getting involved in this? Following that, we are working on ways to work out if people are using it. So we've had to rearrange our user agent strings for our helper libraries so that they all kind of report a little bit more on kind of where they're being used, which I think we think is going to be really useful, because ultimately, like, the CLI is using the Node package, but not all calls from the Node package is obviously from the CLI. There's plenty of people who've installed the Twilio Node package elsewhere. So finding out which ones are coming from where, and if that is growing usage, that's going to be really interesting, but we haven't quite got there yet. And then it turns out, and then we have layers on top of that. There's plugins for the CLI, which some of which call the APIs, some of which don't need to. But being able to tell if the call came not just from the CLI, not from the Node module, not from the CLI, but from a plugin that was on top of the CLI is also going to be parcel of that as well. So measuring this is ongoing, but we definitely know, we know from kind of user interviews and talking to customers that people are using it, and using it for various things. So we know that it is useful. At least we're pretty happy with that. And yeah, like, so I mean, I personally, I don't normally work on the core of the CLI myself, but on one of the more one of the bigger plugins, which is our serverless plugin, serverless toolkit, we like to call it. Which so that one, I have to step back again. Like, one of the things we released at Twilio was a lightweight serverless platform as well, like Twilio functions and Twilio assets, which allow for people to just host JavaScript and then static assets in our infrastructure and use them, like the functions. The JavaScript can be just called like an AWS Lambda, like a thing like that. We decided that was a good thing, because this is another developer experience thing, really, in that working with webhooks, whilst probably the simplest way you could deal with real-time interactions with a phone call, for example, was still like something that when you start developing and you want to do it on your own computer, suddenly becomes difficult. And we've always pushed like tunneling things like ngrok to use as part of that. To make that easier, but even then people still find it harder. So if we decided, if you could just write JavaScript, write something inside the Twilio console and have that deal with your incoming webhook, then that'd be easier. And of course people wanted to do that, but then you find people wanting to turn that into a more development focused thing. So our first version of that was literally a text box with a bit of syntax highlighting and validation inside the console. But then you want to be able to deploy, source control that, and not just every time you save, you're redeploying something. You want to be able to source control and then set up other deployments. So we built a second version of that, which had an API. And then meanwhile, myself and one of my colleagues, Dominic Kundal, had been working on various different tools that allowed you. Dominic had worked on a tool which was called Twilio Run, which allowed you to basically mimic the functions environment locally. So we'd gone all the way from, we need this remote environment that you can just use from the console to, but I want to develop on my laptop, on my own laptop with that. So he built this node wrapper for that. He built that, and then I could never remember how to set up a project that would work with it. So I built a project generator for that. And that was the first 2 bits to it. We had an API, and then the serverless team added an API. So we added an API set to that. Twilio Run became able to deploy it. And then we packaged it all up into a Twilio plugin, Twilio CLI plugin. And after all that, like I said, all of this is just, it becomes layers upon layers of like, what are people doing right now? Where would people like to get to? And as we build the little tools for it, I think we get to improve that experience. But I'm kind of, once again, I'm looking forward to having a bit more data from where those API calls are coming from to know like how much this is being used. Like I know some of our customers are definitely using these things, but particularly the serverless plugin, I've had to support them at times. But sometimes there's a bug, obviously. We got an interesting bug a few months ago, which was based on what we now deem as a breaking change that happened in one of our dependencies, but not at a major version, which has caused us some problems. Semantic versioning, everyone. It's a great thing.
It is.
But yeah, like so having supported those teams, supported the teams that like this bug caused issues for, means I definitely know that people are using this, and it's exciting to see that. But it's going to be exciting to see more data on it as well.
Well, definitely, and I'm glad you brought up the user agent string concept, which is always important to track, all the different SDKs and different plugins that are using these APIs and get that usage data. Outside of that, you talked about multiple different layers, on top of the CLI. What other things that people can be doing to their SDKs and different things using these APIs to get the right metrics and just make sure that they're able to, figure out whether there's bugs or not, right? Sometimes it could be a single SDK or a single, weird use case that you never saw before.
Not quite sure what you mean by the question there. Can you go?
Is there anything else in terms of best practices that a customer could be doing or a developer platform that could be doing with their SDKs to ensure they're robust and ensure they're, I guess, trackable?
Right, I get you. That's a good question. Like, as you say, like if you had a web application, you can just kind of stick some error tracking in there and things like that. But I don't think we have that kind of thing. We don't phone home with our CLI for anything other than actual API calls. Not to say that we might not do that in the future. Like that kind of thing is interesting, but I think if a bug occurs, if something goes wrong, then the thing will stack trace on the on the terminal. And I'm not sure that's a bad thing. Like when you consider it, the product is for developers, the CLI is for developers, and seeing a stack trace is hopefully understandable for that. And we encourage to raise that as an issue in the repo. And developers are, for the most part, very willing to raise issues and tell you what's wrong with a thing. Almost too willing at times. But I think it'll be interesting to see where we go with this. And as we put the CLI into the hands of a team that is dedicated to it and dedicated to improving things like that. Like, yeah, I'm always wary of the idea of more tracking and things like that. Like if there are CLIs where you have to pass a flag or a command in order to turn off like kind of sharing that data, and maybe if you don't know about that command or flag, you've been sharing your usage of it without knowing about it, and that's potentially privacy encroaching, and so yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that. Like even kind of tracking I'm comfortable with the user agent stuff, because knowing like where something came from is a good thing. But any more than that, like looking after the usage is it goes there's I think there's that line between like making a better product and just like encroaching on other people's work and their privacy and their data. So yeah, I don't want to see that much more tracking like that. And I definitely want it. I'd prefer it to be opt-in rather than opt-out as well. But we'll see.
And when it comes to tracking API calls or logging API calls, is there anything that you do to be privacy conscious and careful of your customer data? I'm sure some of that data is very sensitive in nature.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, this is communications data between like businesses and their customers, and sometimes that's we have recommendations on what data should and shouldn't be sent over the various channels. Of course, don't text in your credit card number ever. It's not a good idea. But yeah, we do have like strong protections on actually how that data is kept and looked after within Twilio. Many parts of the business are HIPAA compliant now, and there's a lot of work to deal with GDPR compliance back when that was a huge lift for the company at the time. I think one of the important things here is actually that we are as open about that and about how we look after that data as we possibly can, to the point that it is within the doc. I think it's part of our API definitions, and then that gets generated into our documentation to say which properties on a resource, for example, are deemed personally identifiable information, and then how long we intend to keep that for, and when that's going to expire, when that's going to go out the system. And that's all in the docs. It's all there, kind of at your fingertips as you're looking through that kind of thing. So I think that's really important. And then and yeah, so anything kind of going through the CLI is just calling those API endpoints. So it is handled centrally as far as I can tell. Yeah.
Definitely. And taking a step back and discussing more around developer experience, what does developer empathy mean over at Twilio, and how is it used, or how do you think about it across different functions, whether it's the developer experience team or, as you mentioned, developer relations team and so on?
Yeah, I mean, like I kind of said at the start, like everything in Twilio is developer focused, because it has to be, because they're the first customer. And so developer empathy is, well, we have a bunch of company values at Twilio. And again, company values coming from small companies before I joined Twilio. Twilio was something I'd never seen before, a list of company values. But one of them is wear the customer's shoes. And that's really important to us, because that's not just developer focused. Of course, it's empathy for all of our customers, including the fact that increasingly we have people who are not developers signing up for Twilio accounts and trying to work out what they can do with a platform that they're told is really useful for communications. And so having empathy for that non-developer persona has also been really important. But the empathy for developers is very much the way that we deal with our products as developers ourselves. We try and use it ourselves. I think it's really important and useful, I think, to the business to have this developer network, developer relations team that is not working on the core products themselves, but tends to be or can be like those first users of the products, and be that voice of the developer within the company, voice of the external developer at least. Because we don't know how it's made. We just want to, we hear that we're building a cool new product, and we want to hear that, we want to experience that and use it ourselves. And so a lot of feedback, early feedback, we can give like that. And at the same time, like, it comes from the top as well. Like, Jeff Lawson, CEO, is still a developer, is still, he doesn't write production code for Twilio anymore that I'm aware of. But he is, he's always building with stuff. I think in the last year, he's he's been producing. I think it was like a Zoom cube. It's a whole different set of buttons that you can press to make different things in your video chat occur. Turn yourself on and off mute, and big button to hang up, that kind of thing. So it's good to see that, like, you know, he is finding time to continue to be a developer and a builder, and that kind of then filters down through the rest of the company as well.
Well, that's an interesting point. And, you know, speaking on, you know, both supporting customers and developers at the same time, and, you know, wearing their hat or wearing their shoes. You know, nowadays developers are not a single persona, right? We have some folks who are expert developers. We also have folks who are, you know, just learning to code for the very first time, or using maybe a no-code solution. How do you support all those different developers at the same time?
That's it's increasingly hard to do that, but you're right. Like, we have a whole gamut, a whole range of developers using or trying to use the platform. So yeah, I think we actually are trying to support that from the ground up. I mentioned Twilio Quest earlier, and a lot of the Twilio Quest team are doing work to kind of get add more kind of early stage how to develop content. I believe there's a lesson coming out on like working with APIs, like not specifically the Twilio API, but like what is an API and how to work with one, as a new lesson for the game. And we're trying to get this, trying to get Twilio Quest into universities starting in the US to try and help out and teach people who are new to programming and need to get on board with that, because it's such a useful skill for almost any role these days. So we're working from there. We also have done a lot of work in the last couple of years to produce kind of example or usable applications that people can build and install into their Twilio accounts without having to know what the code is, although there is sort of code behind it. This is what we call the Twilio code exchange. Well, the code exchange itself is kind of example projects, and then there are quick deploy apps within that, which is like you hit a button, fill in a couple of details, and you now have a functional Twilio application that you can go and use. We've released a couple recently that have been around kind of notifications and information for like vaccine hesitancy kind of stuff. As you know, Twilio has a bit of a plan to try and help as many people get vaccinated as possible during this pandemic. And so like we have examples for that, but like we have, you know, simple ones for like a one-click, just get a voicemail kind of thing going as well. So those kind of one-click and instant applications, quick deploy applications, they're there for, I think, what we're calling sort of citizen developers, people who aren't necessarily professional developers, but want to achieve something. But the code is there behind it as well. And so if you do deploy it and you want to change it, you can get a developer involved and update that. And then, right, you mentioned low code tools, and we've had, I can't remember when it came out, but Twilio Studio has been that kind of, low code, I say. Like, in order to do a few things, there's a couple of widgets within the drag and drop interface that can either call a Twilio function or send off an HTTP request. But really, like that being able to build an entire communications flow in drag and drop has been enormously good for unlocking product managers and other things on customer side to achieve a lot of the, not even just the basics, but a lot of the communication flow before having to get a developer involved. And that is really useful because, you know, as developers, we don't want to be doing the same thing over and over again. So just being able to build the interesting parts of those systems, I think has been really good too. But yeah, like we're also fully happy to support you know, expert developers, and you know, they're the ones that want the API references, they want the libraries, and they want to be left to go about it as well, and that's exciting. And you know, that support, and this is why I think we now have we've got a more focus on our community team these days as well. So we have forums in beta, which is kind of weird to think that Twilio is like a 13-14-year-old company that hasn't really had a forum. for the community, at least a first party one for all that time. I think we kind of have and haven't at different times, but we've got a renewed focus on that so that people can indeed come together, help each other, but also get a bit of help from people at Twilio. But we take that out as well. Like you'll rarely find, I plan for it rarely to be find that a Stack Overflow question tagged Twilio doesn't have an answer from one of us as well. So we want to, we're there to support people in wherever and however they want to build with Twilio. And those, I'm sure there's many more ways than that, but those are the ones that come to mind.
Definitely. And I love the one-click, install or those type of, installation processes. The example of, batteries included but optional. You can modify as needed, but just get started as quick as possible. You mentioned COVID and how you've been thinking about that. I'm just curious, how has DevRel changed since COVID hit, especially with events no longer happening in person, and has it been accelerant? Has it been beneficial in a way in terms of reaching developers?
Yes and no. The difference for me certainly has been I've been right here for a lot more of my time rather than out and seeing people in person. And I'm definitely I'm definitely missing that kind of in person talking to people and getting people excited about things. But on the other hand, I think it actually has led to reaching a whole bunch of different people in different places as well. That the way that events and meetups and other kind of those communities have kind of gone online has led to people from all over being able to take part in them, not just people who could who live in the right place or can afford to get there at the right time. I think that has democratized things a lot. For developer relations, it makes it a little bit more difficult. I think I'm yet to see an online event that has the same sponsor experience as an in-person event, and that's, I think that's understandable. When if you have a bunch of talks and a gap in the middle, but people are at home watching it, they're going to go make a cup of tea or coffee in that break. They're not going to go hang out at the virtual booths, and that's fine. We have to work on better ways to engage with people, and I think we still are. But that's an ongoing thing to work on within events as well.
That's definitely a really good point. Just around the events and the fact that it's hard to network, right? And going to a conference or something, one of the easiest ways to meet new people is by going hanging around the booths and the happy hours and all the other activities going on, the hackathons and such.
Exactly. I do all my best work at the after party.
Funny enough, right? Cool. So my last question is just around the future of APIs and DevRel. What do you see next, and where do you see APIs going?
That's tough. I think there's a bunch of, within the bigger API companies, a lot of consolidation right now. And I obviously I'm saying that from the point of view of Twilio, where we buy in the occasional other API company. But there's a bit more of that going around. But I feel like more recently there's been a bunch of more, let's say, fundamental tools being. We're going back to basics, things like databases and other connectivity, things like that, are new and exciting, which is sort of a surprise to me. But I guess there's new and better fundamental technology that's driving this. Though, of course, anybody trying to do a completely fundamental thing like a database is fighting against your big three cloud operators regardless. So you really, I guess, have to have a very impressive reason to exist, and so I'm excited to. I haven't managed to play with many of them myself, but excited to do so at some point. What's the future for it though? I don't know. I think it's getting more difficult to enter the API space because there's so many things you kind of need to provide to bring that same experience that somebody who's been doing it for a decade or more has. Of course, like there are open source tools that have come along with this kind of thing, which make it easier to get there. But there's a lot. It's just a lot to think about. And it's one thing that even we, I think, have shied away from, is sort of providing UI kits to deal with that kind of thing as well. I think Stripe's very good at like providing actual UIs for things as well. But being able to do that across not only browsers. Sorry, my dog just arrived home. You can hear her in the background. Being able to provide UIs across not just browsers and JavaScript front ends and the kind of frameworks that are there, but then the native native applications, and then their frameworks, and then their cross-platform frameworks. Your Flutter and React Native, that kind of thing. There's a lot to maybe produce when you come out with this. So I kind of wish anyone well who's building new things in API spaces, because there's a lot to consider and a lot to think about. Even though, yeah, as a developer, I think it's a wonderful time to be building products and building applications, because there's such a lot of tooling available to you to build the way you want to. So as an API company, being able to provide everything for those people is kind of difficult, though.
Indeed, there is a lot of tooling out there, and a lot of new API first or developer first companies coming about, and but it requires a very critical skill set, right? So, well, thank you very much, Phil, for joining us today on our podcast, and looking forward to see what's next over at Twilio and over at Signal.
Thank you very much.
You have a good one.